I almost started to say Titus, but it's 1 Thessalonians. I don't know where that was coming from, but I almost said it. But 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. In the first, actually going back to chapter 2 and verse 17, we have a longer section dealing with Paul's prayer and concern for them, the Thessalonians. We see in verse 17 through 20 his concern for them and wishing to see them, that they were his glory and joy. And so in the first 5 verses of chapter 3, we see that he sent Timothy. And in the first 2 verses, we saw that he would send him to strengthen and encourage them in their faith. Then in verses 3 and verse 4, that they're not moved from their faith by persecution. Verse 5, to find out their faith. So that's why Timothy was sent. Now then, starting in verse 6 and going through verse 10, Timothy's report, which comforts Paul, is the way in which I titled this section. He says, "But now when Timothy or Timotheus came from you unto us, and brought us good tidings of your faith and charity, which we have good remembrance of you always, desiring greatly to see us, as we also to see you." This begins clearly another section, as the previous section is that he's going to send Timothy to the Thessalonians to find out these things. Starting in verse 6, Timothy has returned. The idea of now, or some have even put it just now. If that just now is the way in which it should be expressed, think of, again, the situation that here's some people who were saying, Paul doesn't really care about you. He left. He hadn't come back. He's not coming back. He doesn't care about you. And so he sends Timothy, and Timothy comes back, gives him a report, and he says, basically, just now, he's gotten back. In other words, I got this report, and I immediately started writing to you. Again, it shows a far different picture than what some in Thessalonica seem to be trying to portray about Paul. So he has just returned with word about the Thessalonians. And basically that time frame from the time in which Paul had been chased out of Thessalonica to the present. So he's just catching him up as to the events at the church there. He expressed his deep concern and anguish over them. And that now has been relieved by Timothy's report. And have you ever seen someone who just so tensed up and they are burdened by something that happens, and then they get the report and there's a sigh of relief. That's kind of the way Paul is here, because he's gotten this report now from Timothy, and it's a good report from everything. Timothy came to Paul while Paul was in Corinth, We see this in Acts 17 and verse 5, where he says, and they that conducted Paul brought him unto Athens, and receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timotheus for to come to him with all speed, they departed. 17:15. I said 5. I've got it down 15. Y'all just heard it wrong. All of y'all heard it wrong. Yeah, I get that. Acts 17:15. And then in Acts 18 and verse 5, not 15, don't miss Acts 18 and verse 5, that when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. So, Silas, or Silvanus, also came to Paul while he was at Corinth. Timothy came to Paul while he was at Corinth. Now, we're not told the exact case, but either Silas comes to Paul first, and thus the us that Paul uses here in verse 6 came from you unto us, plural, and brought us good tidings. Thus the plural there, us, instead of the singular for just simply Paul. So it could be that Silas comes to Paul, meets up with Paul, then at a later time Timothy comes, both times at Corinth. There is, though, the possibility that Timothy met up with Silas, and then both of them come to Paul together. Thus, the literary use of us, the plural. I'll bet nobody in here has ever used the plural for themselves in speaking. Right? Nobody's ever done that. We do it all the time. That's why I use we do it all the time. We use a plural when we're talking about ourselves. Yes, we were. So that is a possibility that Timothy meets with Silas, and then both of them come to Paul in Corinth. But Timothy brought unto us good tidings of your faith. The word good tidings, does that ring a bell as far as another word? Gospel. Yeah. It's the same word. Euangelizo in the Greek. Translated generally gospel. It means good news or glad tidings. It here is a verb, and it is used with the common usage, just a everyday usage of the term. Let me just deviate for a second in relationship to the Greek language in particular, because I started to say years ago, probably a couple of 100 years ago. But so years ago, thinking of it many years ago, there was the thinking that the Greek of the Bible was a divine language and a specialized language. And then later on, that thinking was disproven. It was the common language of the day, and thus it's referred to now as Koine Greek. Koine very simply means common Greek, common language. Everyone spoke it, basically. The terms that are used in the Bible, just like this, euangelizo, gospel, were terms that were in common usage in most cases. So they had a common usage. The Bible often takes those terms that were in common usage and applies them in a specialized way. Now, the Bible with the word euangelizo, the gospel, it generally applies it in a specialized way, but here Paul is using it in the common way. Now, in the specialized way would be the gospel of Jesus Christ and that good news of the salvation that comes through him. But it could have been any type of good news was a gospel and would have been referred to as a gospel in that at that time frame. This is, as far as I can determine, the only time Paul uses this term in a common way. All of the other times in which Paul uses it, it's referring to the gospel of Christ, that specialized way. But here, as a result, you can start seeing how great news this was to Paul, Timothy's report. That he would refer to Timothy's report about these brethren in Thessalonica, that's gospel to me. That's good news. The report, or the good news, was threefold in nature. Their faith, their love, and their remembrance of them, or Paul, was always good. Some try and divide it into a fourth of their desire to see Paul would be a fourth, desiring greatly to see us. And so they would say it's a fourfold gospel. Either way, you could divide it either way. That their remembrance of him included the desire to see them, or that you separate those into two different separate groups. Faith. Your faith. It's a common word for faith, Greek word pistis. It means what can be believed, according to Swanson's lexicon. But it can also apply itself to one's faithfulness, trustworthiness, their complete dependency, or not dependency, dependability. These individuals are dependable. I place my faith, I place my trust or confidence in them because they are trustworthy. We know some individuals that are like that. You ask them to do something, or they say they're going to do something, you can make, you don't even have to worry about it anymore. It's going to be done. We also probably all know individuals that will tell us they're going to do something, and that time comes when it's supposed to have been done and it's not done, and we mention it to them again and again and again, and it never gets done, and finally you just give up and do it yourself. One's dependable, our faith in him. The other's not. Some has suggested when it says about their faith here is that refers to their inward religion. There's a possibility of that, especially in relationship to charity, that we'll talk about next. But an inward religion. Now, Paul had sent Timothy to establish them in the faith. We see that in chapter 3 and verse 2, where he says, "And sent Timotheus, our brother and minister and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and to comfort you concerning your faith." So he needed them to be established in the faith. Also, we see in verse 5, "For this cause, when I could no longer forbear, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter have tempted you, and our labor be in vain." He wanted them to be established in the faith, and he also now wants to know about their faith. So Paul had converted them, he wanted them established in the faith, and now then he's wanting to know a report about their faith. Paul certainly shows an interest in these Thessalonian brethren. Far too many times, just the history of the Lord's church in the last 50 years or 60 years or so is that we had a big, major push to get people baptized. And we recognize and should recognize the importance of baptism, and I'm not speaking in any way in a disparaging term about the need to be baptized. But then we had such a push and emphasis to be baptized that we never really taught them the essential things that they needed to know to be grounded in the faith. And then after baptism, we kind of left them alone to fend for themselves instead of establishing them in the faith. And those aspects, those attitudes are wrong. And I think it has led to a great deal of the apostasy that we see in the Lord's church now. There's things that are taking place in congregations now that basically there were denominational thoughts and ideas years ago, and we bring them into the church then. And part of that reason is because, very simply, they weren't taught the truth in a proper way early on. We got them in the watery grave of baptism, but we did not establish them, and in a lot of cases we didn't get the denominationalism out of them. And they're just as denominational now as they were then. They just got baptized. Paul wasn't like that. He taught them the truth. He wanted them established in the faith. Now then he wants a report about it. Now then, Timothy's report is that their faith towards God had remained since Paul had left them. And we've already discussed several times about the persecutions that they were enduring, and it would have been very easy for them to have fallen away. But now then, Timothy's bringing this report of their faith, their faithfulness. They have remained faithful. And that is bringing joy to Paul. It should always be causing us joy to hear of others' faithfulness and faith. John, for example, in 2 John in verse 4, says that I rejoiced greatly that I found of thy children walking in truth, as we have received a commandment from God, from the Father. Rejoice greatly. Then as he writes the third letter, 3 John, verse 3 and verse 4, again he says, for I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee. Even as thou walkest in truth, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. I know parents struggle when their children are not faithful. It is very painful. Well, these Thessalonians were like Paul's children as far as the gospel of Jesus Christ, since he had taught it to them. And so, hearing words from Timothy of their faith, well, brought him great joy. Even as John, I rejoice greatly. Why? Because children are walking in truth. We should all be likened to that. Not just with our own physical families, but with all individuals who continue in faithfulness. Charity. This is a Greek word, agape. And just as an aside, agape love is probably one of the most misused words in the Bible. It is applied to just about anything and everything today. I remember, this is many years ago, but a Greek student, I say student, he was a teacher as well of Greek, good Greeks, very knowledgeable in Greek. He argued that charity was a good translation instead of using love for the word agape, because it had been so misused through the years even then, and charity indicates some type of action toward others, which is a good aspect in relationship to thinking about agape. It is a serving type of love. Mention that faith, that some have suggested that it has reference to their inward religion. The agape or charity here might refer to the outward religion, or the demonstration of the inward religion of one's faith. One has faith, that's his inward religion, if you would, And he demonstrates it outwardly by his actions. And that would be the charity, or agape. Some think that this love here, or charity, has reference to the Thessalonians' love for God. Primarily, or love for God. Of course, that is the first and great commandment, that we love God with all of our being. But if we love God, aren't we going to also love others? Or maybe we should ask it, how is it possible not to love others if we love God? You can't. In fact, didn't John tell us that if you say that you love your brother and yet you love God and yet you hate your brother, you're a liar and the truth's not in you? If you love God, love of your brethren will also follow. It might deal with those, but also within the context here. It might be that Timothy is reporting that they have a special love in their hearts for Paul. How many of you can think back to the person who taught you the gospel, maybe baptized you, and isn't there a special affection for those individuals that do that? Well, that might be the very thing that Timothy is reporting back to Paul. They have a special love for you. And so within the context, as what we're saying in 1 Thessalonians, it could have reference to that as well, or maybe particular. Turn over to Galatians 5 and verse 6 for a second. And you'll see these two words being used again when Paul writes, "For in Christ, or Jesus Christ, neither circumcision availeth anything nor uncircumcision, but faith which worketh by love." So you have the combination of faith and love being used there in Galatians as well. Good remembrance. That ye have good remembrance of us always. Good is from the Greek word agathos. And it is that which is beneficial in its effect, or it is morally good. There's a couple of different words that are translated good from the Greek language. This is that which deals with beneficial in its effect, or morally good. Thus, this is a kindly remembrance of Paul. A good, morally beneficial, morally excellent remembrance of Paul. Now, wouldn't that make Paul feel good? You can see why he is overjoyed with Timothy's report. Remembrance is from a word which Paul used earlier in the book, chapter 1 and verse 2. It says, "We give thanks to God always for you all, making mention of you in our prayers." The word mention there is the same word as remembrance here. So Paul was remembering them always in their prayers. Well, they had a good remembrance of Paul. So it was working together as far as these two. might add that they had a good remembrance of Paul, and you could include Silas and Timothy in that, even though there was persecution that came as a result of what they had done, the teaching that they had given. And so in spite of the persecution that came, we have good remembrance of it. That good remembrance then caused them to desire greatly to see Paul. And I say some separate those two, but it seems like the good remembrance is that which causes the desire. So they had an equal longing to see each other. Paul had a great desire to see the Thessalonians. The Thessalonians had a great desire to see Paul. This word greatly desire, or desiring greatly, is from a Greek word which means to long for greatly. But then Thayer in his lexicon adds this word, or this to it, to pursue with love, to long after. And I thought that was an interesting way in which to put it. They pursued with love each other, longing after each other. Really a very wonderful type of a situation between Paul and the Thessalonians. Verse 7 then, therefore, brethren, we were comforted over you in all of our affliction and distress by your faith. So now then, because of Paul's or Timothy's positive report, Paul was comforted, consoled. To use maybe an expression that we have, Paul was at his wit's end. And now then all of that has been relieved. And notice again the term brothers that he uses. Therefore, brethren. It's that affectionate term that he uses for them on a regular basis. The word comforted is from a Greek word parakaleo. Now then, you have a prefix and a root word. The prefix is para, and the root word is kaleo. If you put a different prefix on, ek, for example, with kaleo, or kalesis, ecclesia. Now, what does ecclesia mean? The church, but it actually, that's the way it's translated, and properly so, but it means the called out. Why? Because kaleo means to call. Ek, to call out, or literally to call out from within. Well, you put a different prefix for this word, para. Para means beside. To call to the side off. He was comforted. He was called to the side off. Think of, in a sad situation, someone's about to die and they want to call someone to the side of them for comfort and for strength during that time. And during the lockdowns that we had, a lot of complaints was that they could not go see their loved ones that were dying. They wanted to give them comfort during that time, to call to the side off, and they couldn't do it. That's the type of word that Paul is using here. Notice chapter 2 and verse 11, and as he talks about, as ye know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father doth his children. In chapter 3 and verse 2, we sent Timotheus, our brother and minister and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and to comfort you concerning your faith. So there was that great concern and care that Paul was having for them. And Paul, by Timothy's coming and giving the report, was thus comforted about their faith. The idea of comforted over you indicates the basis upon which Paul was comforted. In all of our affliction, we talked about this word back in chapter 1 and verse 6, that ye became followers of us and of the Lord, having received the word in much affliction and joy of the Holy Ghost. He uses it again in chapter 3 and verse 3, that no man should be moved by these afflictions, for yourselves know that we are appointed thereunto. So afflictions again. It's the Greek word thalipsis, or thalipsis. And it deals with pressure. I think as we were talking about it last time, I mentioned, have you ever had a pressure headache? Headache from pressure. People that have sinus problems and know the pressure they have up above your eyes and below your eyes in that area because of the pressure that's in your sinuses. This is pressure. Thalipsis. It is a choking pressure under which he was under because of his concern for them. Distress is from another Greek word, which means hardships, trouble, distress, or overbearing tribulation. Now then, what's the difference between afflictions and distresses? Well, let me give a few options. In the exegetical summary, and what this exegetical summary is it takes the views of all of the different major commentaries and summarizes them. So he's summarizing the different views of the difference. If distinctions are to be made, I thought that was interesting. If we're going to make distinctions, the first, distress, refers to difficulties in general, and the second, afflictions, to opposition from people. Or the first indicates that the troubles are unavoidable, while the second focuses on the pressure they bring. Or, not through yet, or the first refers to distress resulting from pressures, while the second refers to the physical harm. Now then, the very first thing that he said there, if distinctions are to be made, might be the best comment that he made regarding all of these various views. Should we even try to make distinctions? Well, I'm not sure that we should. have a quote by Brother Raymond Kelsey. But because Andrew's about to ring that second bell, I won't have time to read it, so we'll start with that, and Lord willing, next week. So remember that we're talking about these two words, distress and afflictions, and we'll go from there.